much for joining us. My name is Rosemary Cole, and on behalf of the Catholic Information Center and our director, Father Charles Trulos, it is my pleasure to welcome everyone who is joining us here tonight in person and online, and to introduce Stephanie Gray, renowned pro-life international speaker and author. Stephanie has given over 800 pro-life presentations across the globe and has spoken at many post-secondary institutions such as Yale University, Berkeley, and the University of Sussex in England, to name a few. She has debated a variety of abortion advocates, including late-term abortionist Dr. Fraser Fellows, Executive Director of the National Coalition of Abortion Providers, Ron Fitzsimmons, Philosophy Professor and recipient of the Order of Canada, Dr. Jan Neverson, and the legal Director of NARAL, Pro-Choice America, Elizabeth Cavendish. She has written multiple books, her most recent being Love Unleashes Life, Abortion and the Art of Communicating Truth, and has done hundreds of media interviews with a variety of news outlets, including ABC, NBC, Fox, CTV News, CBC News, Global News, EWTN, Catholic Answers Radio, and 100 Huntley Street's Listen Up, among many others. Tonight, Stephanie shares her insights and experiences of not only how she prepared for her now viral Google Talk, but also how she prepares in general for interacting with the culture. She will offer practical takeaways for you to apply to your own life and incorporate stories of professionals in the world going about their daily duties who have won people over around them by their witness. And with that, please join me in welcoming Stephanie Gray.
Thank you very much. So it's wonderful to be here. It was April 19th, 1 year ago, very late at night. I was staying with a friend of mine in Berkeley, California, and it was 14 hours before I was scheduled to give my presentation at Google headquarters on abortion. And I was filled with anxiety, and I was panicking. And I thought the presentation that I had prayed about, that I had prepared, was all wrong. And I wanted to scrap the whole thing, but I wasn't sure what I should replace it with, and I was trying to think about what I should do. Well, one of the things I did was text my dear sister. My sister is, you could say, one of my best friends. I'm very close to her, and I can always count on her to be there for me in moments of crisis. My sister is also a breastfeeding mother, which means any time of night if I text her, she's probably going to get back to me fairly quickly. So it was late, and I texted her that I was panicking, I had no peace, I think I needed to scrap that talk and do something different. And in great wisdom, she knew that what I was experiencing was spiritual attack. My sister is very placid, but in this text, she very sternly said, "Tell Satan to go to hell." Then she said, "I want you to roll over and go to sleep. And when you wake up, I want you to give the presentation that you have planned to give." And so I did. And so what I want to do this evening is share with you some of the insights that I have gleaned through preparing and delivering that presentation, as well as over the 15 years that I've been working full-time in the pro-life movement, the experiences and insights that I have learned about how to really reach the culture and have transformative conversations and encounters with those in our midst. In particular, I want to talk about three things. The first is I want to talk about the need to make prayer primary before any action that we take, the foundation from which our action springs. The second thing I want to talk about is the power of questions in really reaching the hearts of people that we engage. And the third thing I want to talk about is people who in their own spheres of influence have made a positive difference in their worlds, with the hope that learning their stories will convict all of us to more fruitfully make an impact in our worlds, in our spheres of influence. In terms of the importance of prayer being the foundation from which our action springs, one of my previous spiritual directors encouraged me several years ago to read a book I highly recommend called The Soul of the Apostolate. Perhaps it's on sale in your bookstore, is it? Great, Father, that's wonderful. How many of you have heard of the book The Soul of the Apostolate? Okay, Larry and Mary, wonderful. A couple others. I can't recommend this book enough. The Soul of the Apostolate's whole premise is that when you are involved in apostolic activity, when you're doing ministry work, when you in some way, directly or indirectly, are sharing the gospel, there can be this tendency to focus on the scripture passage, the harvest is plentiful, but what? The laborers are few. And then guess what? We make up the rest of that passage. You see, we can think the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. So I have to go and get out into that harvest and do all the labor the other laborers aren't around to do. And that's not what that passage ends with. It says the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Then how does it end? We forget that part, don't we? That's the problem. And you've read the Soul of the Apostolate, haven't you? Pray, therefore, that the Lord of the harvest will send more people into the harvest. Pray. Pray. And so the Soul of the Apostolate says that when we're involved in apostolic activity, we can't get so focused on the need to do that we prioritize that over the need to be. We really need to focus on first slowing down, being still, and realizing God is God. And the busier we are, the more we need to prioritize a life of prayer. And there's a great illustration in this book that St. Bernard came up with where he said we are to be reservoirs and not channels. Reservoirs and not channels. If we think about those two bodies of water and how different they are, the channel, the water just flows through. That's like the busy soul, going, doing, seeing all this work that needs to be done and never taking time to slow down. The reservoir is very different. In a reservoir, the water fills up and then the excess overflows. And that's the soul of the apostolate. That's the heart of any activity that is going to bear much fruit, where we first fill up with the Holy Spirit, and once we've allowed ourselves to be full, we allow that to then overflow into our activities. And so when it was February of last year that a staff member at Google reached out to me and asked if I would be open to speaking at Google headquarters on the topic of abortion, I immediately entered into prayer. I, of course, was deeply convicted that this would be a profound opportunity that I needed to say yes to, but I thought, what are the chances that Google is going to say yes to this? So I knew that prayer would have to really be a focus so that if this was something God wanted, it would indeed come to fruition. And one of the first things that I had to do after praying was prepare a description or a proposal of what an anti-abortion presentation would look like at Google. And so as I prayed, I really thought about what language would resonate with this secular environment and how to take the traditional anti-abortion message and package it in a way so that while the message was the same, the packaging would be something that the powers that be at Google would feel it resonates with them and is something that they would say yes to. And so as a result of prayer, some of the ideas that came to mind was that I was going to reference people like Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist Dr. Viktor Frankl. And I'm going to interweave his ideas and concepts and philosophies into this presentation on abortion. I pitched that in my experience of meeting so many people who don't share my view, of having coffee with abortionists before debating them, of meeting people who have been victims of sexual assault, who have been, raised in poverty and environments of crisis, and encountering their ideas on abortion from the worlds that they've lived in, and how that would influence how I would share my message. And then I thought, and the language I used was, in the abortion debate, we often hear it being pro-life versus pro-choice. And this presentation was really going to be pro-conversation. So all of this was packaged together, sent off to them, and then more praying happened. I thought, okay, God, show your glory. If you want this to happen, then you have to influence the powers that be to say yes. And so when I heard back, I was simply asked, what date works for you? And so I thought, Okay, well, we will be moving forward. So then once there was confirmation that the proposal I prayed over was something that was accepted, the next thing I needed to pray about was what I was actually going to say. So I have been speaking formally on this topic since I was 18, so that is this July will be 20 years that I have been speaking about abortion. So let's just say I've developed a lot of content over the years. And so there's always a real discernment about when you have a limited amount of time and a very particular audience, how do you best package your message for that audience? And so what I did was I headed straight for adoration. And after spending some time in front of our Lord, I got my notepad and my pen, and I just said, Jesus, what do you want me to say, Google? What do you think this audience needs to hear? Because I knew God knew the hearts of not only the people that would be in attendance, but the people who would ultimately view the presentation via the internet. And I didn't know their hearts. So what message did they really need to hear? And so as I was taking notes of just ideas that would come to my mind, the overarching theme was love. And I actually resisted it at first. And I was like, no, God, I'm being brought in because they're all engineer types and they're super logical. So I need to focus on the logic of everything. But the overarching message that kept coming back to mind was love. St. Thomas Aquinas says, is to will the others good. And those of you who have seen the presentation will know that one of the main points of the 3 points that I really emphasized in my presentation is that we need to put others ahead of ourselves. We need to put others ahead of ourselves, which is ultimately what the message of love is about. So after preparing all of that, then I had that moment of crisis that maybe all of that was wrong. And of course, as I mentioned, my wise sister realized, wait a minute, you've prayed about this, you prepared, and you experienced peace. And God is a God of peace. So if you're experiencing agitation right now, that is not of God. Go with the original plan that you came up with at a time of peace. And so the next morning, when I woke up and was going to be heading to Google headquarters, of course, wanted to start the day with the sacrament and the sacrament of Holy Eucharist. And so one prayer that I have found very helpful of late is to take the passage where Mary visited Elizabeth and John the Baptist leapt in Elizabeth's womb. And then Mary said, my soul magnifies the Lord. And I've turned that into a prayer and very much have continually prayed, especially in my pro-life work, that I might magnify the Lord in every encounter that I have. And I believe that's a prayer that all of us can pray in every encounter. And if you think about magnifying something, when you magnify something, you do not change what it looks like. You change where you look. You zoom in and focus largely on one particular spot. And so we all have good bits and bad bits. We've got our vice, we've got our virtue. And so our prayer ought to be that we magnify the Lord, that we magnify the virtue, that the image of God which is in each one of us is magnified in every encounter that we have. And not only did I want to magnify the Lord, but I wanted to be like Mary and be a living tabernacle. She, of course, bore our Lord in her womb, but by consuming him in the Eucharist, I wanted to in some way bring that Eucharistic presence through my body, having received our Lord, to the audience at Google. And it's so important to have this spiritual foundation because we are in a spiritual battle. As we know from Ephesians 6, we're told, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand against the wiles of the devil. For we are not contending against flesh and blood, but against the principalities, against the powers, against the world rulers of this present darkness, against the spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore, take the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. Stand, therefore, having girded your loins with truth, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness, and having shod your feet with the equipment of the gospel of peace. Besides all these, taking the shield of faith, which you can quench all the flaming darts of the evil one, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. And so with all that in mind, I left the chapel and I prepared to get to Mountain View, California. Now, I am now an experienced Uber user, but I wasn't a year ago. And so the friend that I was staying with arranged via her Uber app for me to get to Google. So she was at her place and I was at the church, and so she texted me and said, "This is what the car is, just hop in." So I did, and even though I knew from her how the system worked, that she would have punched in the address, I'm a little type A, so as soon as I got in the car, I just said, "By the way, just want to confirm the address." And then the Uber driver said, "Yeah, oh, you know what? I have another appointment later, and that's going to take too long. I'm sorry, I can't drive you." And I was like, "Really? I thought you confirmed. Isn't that how that works? Like, you confirmed, so now we have to go?" And he goes, "Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't drive you." And I thought, well, that's odd. So I get out and I call my friend. I'm like, "Yeah, the Uber driver won't take me there." And she goes, "What? That's weird." And she goes, "Well, let me call another one, or do another one." So she put in her phone. Second Uber driver comes. I get in the back. It was deja vu again. I'm like, "I just want to confirm you have the address." He goes, "Yeah." And then he said, "Yeah, you know, I'm not going to be able to go. I actually can't go that far." And I was like, "What?" So then I get out of his car and I call my friend again. I'm like, "This is so weird. It's like Satan doesn't want me to get there." So then she, types in for a third Uber driver. At this point, I'm like, am I being saved from a car accident with those other two drivers, or is something else going to happen? So anyways, the third Uber driver, everything worked out fine. He starts driving me, and I said, "Just so you know, I'm going to be doing some work back here." And so I was reviewing my notes and I was praying. And then at one point, the car just kind of swerved over the line, and I thought, oh my gosh, I think he's falling asleep. So I thought, prayed enough, prepared enough, I'm going to talk to my Uber driver. And so thankfully, I got to Google in one piece. But the spiritual attack continued, because when I got to the room that I was going to speak in, there was a flickering light. And that wouldn't bother me, except the goal I was ultimately hoping to achieve was that the video recording would be put up on Google's YouTube channel, knowing that they had such a broad audience, and it would be the platform from which the pro-life message is communicated, not by pro-lifers, but by a very secular institution that typically we don't associate as being friendly to pro-lifers. So it was very important that this recording work out. And I was told by a staff member that if that flickering light is not fixed, it's going to be annoying for anyone watching the recording, and they might use that as grounds to not upload the video because it's not high enough quality. So then we were praying like crazy that the light would be fixed. So then the light seemed to get fixed, and it was time to start, and the videographer wasn't there. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, videographer still not there. And so it was a question of, do we proceed with the presentation, or do we wait, knowing that this recording is very important? So we waited 45 minutes, delaying the start of the talk. But the videographer came, the presentation was recorded, and 2 months later, it was uploaded. So all of that to say, what that experience really taught me is the importance of prayer, and that we are indeed in a spiritual battle. And there are all kinds of forces that are going to come up against us. And we need to maintain a spirit of peace and continual surrender to God. My sister and brother-in-law recently shared with me a phenomenal novena that is one of my favorites now, and it's called the Surrender Novena, where you just read a short reflection as though Jesus is speaking to us about being calm and stop worrying and trust me. And then at the end of each day you say, "Jesus, I surrender myself to you. Take care of everything." And I would say that was very much the spirit with which I entered into this opportunity and ultimately executed the presentation. All the things that went on, it was, "Jesus, I surrender to you. Take care of everything." And the more I saw myself surrendering, the more I saw God's mighty hand in everything that happened. Besides the importance of prayer being the foundation from which we enter into engaging the culture, encountering others, the second thing I wanted to talk about this evening is the importance of asking questions of those that we dialogue with. There are a lot of times we don't speak up, whether one-on-one with a family member, a friend, or a colleague, or whether in a work environment when an opportunity arises. We sometimes don't speak up because we're afraid. We're afraid of what other people will think of us. Or we're afraid of how we think the other person might react. Or we're afraid that we won't come across really well, that we'll fail in explaining why we believe, even if we know what we believe. And while I cannot entirely eliminate the natural fear that may arise whenever a contentious subject is raised in a personal or public or professional setting, I can try to alleviate some of the fears that we face. I may not be able to entirely eliminate, but I can try to alleviate. And I would say that we can try to alleviate the fears, first of all, by making sure prayer is a primary part of our daily life. But secondly, by taking the burden of responsibility to defend everything off of our shoulders, and to place that burden onto the shoulders of the person that we're dialoguing with, or the people that we're talking with. And that's what questions do. When we ask questions of other people, then they're going to do the thinking. They're going to do the talking. And if we know the truth is on our side, then they're going to be in a position where they're needing to defend lies. And we know that it's not possible to ultimately defend lies. And so the person being asked questions, having to explain a false worldview, will eventually experience their own inability to defend their claims, and hopefully, with God's grace, start to realize the holes in their argument, the flaws in their belief, and will come around to a different perspective. Not because we preached at them, not because we got up on a soapbox and talked, but because we sat next to them in a sense, and we asked questions. And through asking questions, we drew a truth out of them that was written on their hearts. I want to share with you a number of encounters I've had over the years in which I've found questions very useful, and I hope in sharing some of these stories that it will give you ideas for the types of questions you can ask, perhaps colleagues or others that you engage on the pro-life topic, particularly the topic of abortion, but this idea can really apply in other settings as well. And what comes to mind, actually, was an encounter I had that started with abortion but moved to a different topic. Several years ago, I spoke at a college campus in Colorado. And at this particular event, I was training pro-life students how to speak to pro-abortion students on campus. So I thought it was one audience. But there was a mole. There was one audience member who had come in who didn't share the mindset of the gathered group, and at the end came up to me and told me that he was pro-abortion. Now, I had no problem that he heard my message, but of course it wasn't tailored to someone like him. So as we began dialoguing back and forth after my talk, he started to share more about his ideas, not only on abortion, but on other things. And he said to me, I used to be Catholic, but now I became an atheist. And so I thought to myself, he has just heard 2 hours of an anti-abortion presentation. I don't think I need to engage him on the topic of abortion anymore. But perhaps we're having this encounter because I'm supposed to engage him on the question of theism and atheism and does God exist or does God not exist. Now, I will admit that I am not as well versed to engage in a debate on the existence of God the way I am on the topic of abortion, but I am well versed in the power of questions. And so I thought to myself, I am not going to prove to this guy that God exists. I'm going to make him prove to me that God doesn't exist. And so I expressed genuine curiosity in his worldview and how he came to the conclusion he did. And so the first question I asked was one of clarification. I said, okay, so you used to be Catholic, but now you would identify as an atheist. He said, yes. I said, I'm curious. For you to go from one view to another very different view, you must have found your new view more compelling. So I'm curious, what is it about atheism that you found so convincing? And he looked at me and just did this. It was like, no joke, it was a rapid fire blink. His eyes were just blinking rapidly. And he didn't really say anything, so I thought, well, I'll give an analogy. And I said, well, look, if I go to a party and they're serving wine, I'm given a choice. They're going to say red or white. I said, I'm going to choose red. And by choosing red, I'm conveying that I find it more compelling than white. There's elements of the red wine that draw me more than the white wine. That's why I pick it. You had Catholicism, now you have atheism. You found one that you're going to choose over the other. It must have been more compelling. What was it about atheism? And he kind of stumbled over his words, but he didn't really have much of an argument to convey to me. But as a result of asking those questions and having a good dialogue with him, I then said, building a rapport with him, I don't know if you'd be willing to share your address with me, but there's this really great author by the name of Peter Kreeft, and he's written extensively on the question of, does God exist or not? I would love as a gift to you to send you his book. And so this guy was willing to give me his address, and I mailed the book. So all because he couldn't defend his view, and as a result of the exchange we had, he was open to learning more on the topic. In another case, I was once on a college campus doing a pro-life exhibit where a student came up to me and said, "I have a question for you." So she knew the power of questions. And then she said to me, "Do you sit under acorns for shade?" And I knew where she was going, but I didn't convey that, and I just answered her question. I said, "No, I do not." And she said, "Exactly. And just as an acorn isn't an oak tree, a fetus isn't a human." So then I took that in and I said to her, "Do you mind if I ask you a question?" She said, "Go ahead." I said, "Would you ever give the keys of your car to a 5-year-old child and tell the child to go for a drive?" She said, "Of course not." And I said, "Okay, so even though you wouldn't give the keys of your car to a 5-year-old, would you acknowledge that the 5-year-old is at least a human being?" She said, "Yes, what's your point?" And I said, "Well, I bring that up because you're right that the acorn isn't an oak tree. In other words, the acorn is not an adult of its species, and it therefore cannot do what adults can do, such as provide shade. In the same way, the 5-year-old cannot do what the adults of his species can do, namely drive a car. But we don't say the 5-year-old isn't human because the 5-year-old can't do what the adults can do. In the same way, we don't say the acorn isn't an oak because the acorn can't do what the adults of its species can do, such as provide shade. The acorn is of the oak family, it's just not the mature tree. The 5-year-old is of the human family, but just is not the mature adult. And in the same way, the embryo and the fetus are of the human family, if they have human parents, but I acknowledge they aren't mature enough and developed enough to do what the adults in their species are capable of doing. The question is, are human rights grounded in being human or in being adults? Are human rights grounded in being human or in being adults? When we ask people questions, it's very important that while we can ask just any question, that we recognize some questions are going to be more effective than others. To give you an example, a pregnancy center director reached out to me and wanted to discuss with me some of these strategies that I often employ of asking questions and making analogies so she could better interact with the clients at her pregnancy center. And so in the course of our conversation, one of the things I said to her was this. I said, pro-lifers will often ask people in the culture, "What if someone aborted you?" Now, why do pro-lifers ask that question of the culture? What if someone aborted you? Any guess? Why would we ask that of someone? What if someone aborted you? What's that? We assume they value their life. So the idea of the question is they're going to say, we expect we're going to get a certain answer. Oh my goodness, that would be horrible. And then we'll say, you're right. And just it would be horrible if someone had aborted you. It would be horrible if someone aborted the preborn child. Here's the problem with that question. If the person we're asking it of does not value themselves, does not value their life, then we might get an answer that doesn't bring us to the conclusion we wanted them to get to. And all too often, I said to this pregnancy center director, when I have heard pro-lifers ask that question, what if someone aborted you? I have heard the abortion supporter come back with, I wish they had. Or, I wouldn't care. Or, I wouldn't know. And so I said to this director, when we want a certain answer, we need to really think through how we ask the question. And I said, what we want to do is first ask the person if they can think of someone that they really care about, someone they really love, whether a relative, someone they're in a romantic relationship with, someone they're close friends with. And I'll say, is there someone that you really are close to, set apart from others? And the moment the person reveals yes, and they tell me who that person is, Now that they've, in their minds, associated compassion and love and affection for that individual, I then say, what if someone had aborted them? And that important difference in how that same idea is conveyed changes everything. And in fact, the pregnancy center director told me after our meeting, within a couple days, a potential client called them. She was faced with an unplanned pregnancy and she was abortion-minded. And as the counselor was talking with this client over the phone, she was trying to learn more about this client. And this client conveyed that she worked at a daycare and she took care of children. So remembering what I had said, the counselor said to this woman, I'd like you to think for a moment about the children you take care of. Do you enjoy looking after them? And she said, oh, I love taking care of the kids. And the counselor said, can you imagine what your days would be like if some or all of those children weren't there because they were aborted? Several days later, the client called back and said she decided to carry to term. And when the counselor asked her what, if anything, had influenced her in terms of that decision, she spoke specifically of the question she'd been asked, thinking about the children that she takes care of in the daycare. So not only do we want to ask questions that are going to help other people in their heart think through things, but we want to try to ask the best questions possible. To give you another example of the power of questions, an obstetrician gynecologist once heard me give a speech about questions, and he came up to me and he said, what you said about questions is so true. He said, I have a patient who has had multiple miscarriages early and late in pregnancy, including a stillbirth. She has gone through so much grief. She wants a child so badly. He said, I was really struck one day when she came to me for another pregnancy test. And when it came back positive, this woman who had wanted a baby so badly said to me, I want to have an abortion. And he said, at first, just all the thoughts going through my head were, that doesn't make sense. You want a baby so badly. And he goes, I didn't say that, but I was thinking that. And he goes, and then I started thinking, wait a minute, maybe she's afraid of loving and losing again. Maybe she's afraid she's going to lose another child and she's going to go through the same grief again that she's been through so many times. And he said, so I asked her a question. I asked her to explain to me again what it was like losing each of those children, what she went through, the toll it took on her. And he said, in a sense, she began to relive it a bit. She talked to me about how she wept every day. She didn't want to get out of bed. She was depressed, almost suicidal. And he said, once I got her to think through all of that, I simply asked another question. What impact do you think having an abortion is going to have on you? And he said it was like a light bulb went off in her mind. And she said, I never thought of it that way. So this doctor didn't get, on a soapbox, as I said earlier, and tried to preach at this woman. He tried to ask just a couple gentle questions to draw out of her motivation for one choice wasn't actually going to solve her fears and her problems. To give you another example of the power of questions, I was debating a philosophy professor several years ago, and he made an argument that's becoming increasingly common on college campuses, what is typically called a bodily rights argument. So instead of denying that preborn children are human persons, what this professor was denying was that the preborn human person has a right to the mother's body. And so he got up in front of 200 college students and he said, I'm going to admit and agree, for the sake of this debate, that embryos and fetuses of human parents are human persons. I'm going to admit that they're equal to all of us. I'm going to admit that they have a right to life, just like you or me. But, he said, I'm still going to make an argument in defense of abortion. And I'm going to make that argument by demonstrating to you that human persons with rights to life do not have a right to use another human person's body. And he said, let me give you an example. Imagine you have a child who's born, you love this child very much, and your child has a kidney disease that is going to kill your child. And the only thing that will save your child is a kidney transplant. He said, I want you to imagine that you as the parent are the only person in the entire world with the right body type to keep your child alive by donating one of your kidneys. And he said, would it be nice of you as the parent to donate one of your kidneys to your child? Yes, he said. Would it save your child's life to donate one of your kidneys to your child? Yes, he said. Would it kill you to donate just one of your kidneys to your child? No, he said, it would not. But, he asked the audience, should the law force you to donate one of your kidneys to your child? No, he said, the law should not. And just as the law should not force a parent to give their born child their kidney, the law should not force a parent to give their preborn child their uterus. What do we do? Well, I'm sitting in front of this audience, pen and paper in hand, looking calm, cool, and collected on the outside, but panicking on the inside, thinking, dear Lord, I do not know what to say to this man and this audience, more importantly. And so I began to take notes, or appear to take notes, and did the first thing that I suggested to you tonight, which is to pray. And so I began to call on the Holy Spirit to give me divine inspiration as to what I should say. And as I was praying, I sensed God actually speak to me. Not that I heard an audible voice, but it was very clear. I sensed God explicitly say, Stephanie, I created the uterus for a different purpose. So I started to think about that over and over. And then as I was thinking more deeply, clarity came and it was my turn to speak. So I got up and I said, Dr. Snedden makes a very compelling argument until we ask ourselves a question. And the question we have to ask ourselves is this: what is the nature and purpose of the kidney versus the nature and purpose of the uterus? Because when we answer those questions, we come to see why a parent ought not be legally obligated to give their kidney, but ought to be legally obligated to give their uterus. I said, the kidney exists in my body for my body. The uterus, I said, is very different. It's an organ in my body different from all the others, in that it exists while in my body every single month, getting ready for someone else's body. I can live without my uterus, but my offspring cannot. It's an organ that you could say exists more for the next generation than it exists for me, and therefore my offspring can claim a right to that in a way my offspring cannot claim a right to my kidney or another body part. Apparently, it was reported back to me that the professor told his class that he was up all night trying to think of a response. So I like to say that is the fruit of prayer. The final thing that I wanted to speak about this evening before opening up to questions, like I could go on at length, but I want to hear your questions. So the third and final thing I want to talk about are stories of various people that I have met over the years who have seized the opportunity in their midst to make a positive difference. And in telling you some of these stories, I want to begin with what I often call as a tale of two physicians. Many years ago now, I spoke at an evangelical church, and a short while later, one of the audience members reached out to me and told me that a friend of his was pregnant and really wanted an abortion, and he wanted to know what to do. And so in the course of giving him ideas of things that he could say and different approaches to take, I said to him, it's really important that we get your friend to a Christian doctor. And he said, actually, I already took her to my Christian doctor. I said, that's fantastic. He said, no, not really. When she left that doctor's office, she walked out with a piece of paper in her hands with a phone number to the abortion clinic. Now contrast that with another physician several years ago who contacted me. One of her patients was just shy of the 20th week of pregnancy, halfway through, and she had gone to a private ultrasound clinic where she found out via ultrasound she was pregnant with a female fetus. This woman did not want a baby girl, and so she came to her doctor to find out how she could get a sex-selective abortion. This physician contacted me with 2 concerns. Concern number 1 she had, am I forced to refer this patient on and help facilitate her obtaining the abortion? Concern number 2, how do I try to dissuade my patient from following through on this? When it came to concern number 1, I assured her that there was no legal duty to refer this patient on for abortion. And I made the point that even if there was a legal duty, she had a moral duty to disobey an unjust law, which, as Dr. King has said, is no law at all. But I really encouraged her on her second concern. It is not enough to just wash our hands and try to keep ourselves clean from involvement in immoral behavior. We want to try to persuade others to avoid their own involvement in immoral behavior. And so I really encouraged this doctor to think about all the different ways she could try to convince her patient to choose life. I connected this physician to a Mandarin-speaking physician in her city. They met and strategized. I gave her resources that she could share, ideas, things to say. The physician was a person of faith, and as she was praying that night, she really sensed God say to her, "Let this woman know how much I love her. Let this woman know how much I love her." The next day, the physician had a follow-up appointment with the patient. And when she sat down with the patient's husband, her attitude, again, was not to preach, but to ask questions, to seek to understand. Why do you want this particular abortion? Why do you not want a baby girl? And in the course of that exchange, the patient revealed something to her doctor that she'd never told her previously. And that is, she was raised in a home in which she was taught her life was meaningless because she was a girl. She was routinely locked in a tiny closet in the family home, and she was deprived of food and of water and of the bathroom. And then when it got really cold outside, the family would unlock that closet and they would let her out, and then they would open the front door and they would force her to stand outdoors in the cold. And when the doctor learned all of this, she thought to herself, this woman doesn't want to kill a girl. This woman wants to spare a girl the kind of suffering and abuse that she has lived through. Now, she's wrong that abortion is the solution to that. She's wrong that she's going to repeat the cycle of abuse, but in her fragile emotional state, because of her trauma, that's where she was led in her thinking. And so this doctor very gently reasoned with her and let her talk. And in the course of that conversation, that patient said she felt her doctor was the first person she'd ever encountered who so authentically cared about her. Several months later, at Easter time, a baby girl was born. 2 doctors, 2 patients considering abortion, 2 very different responses. It is so important that each of us take a step back and think about who we know and where we're placed and what talents we have. And we use these to further Christ's kingdom here on earth. That we learn to raise our voices, to be salt and to be light. There's a nurse that I know who was working in a small town in a clinic where the morning after pill was being administered, and she did not have to be involved in any of that until this day came along where one of her bosses said that they expected this nurse to start administering this to patients. And this nurse was very uncomfortable with that and said, I actually don't believe in the morning after pill. I don't want to give this to patients. And she was essentially told that if she didn't comply, she would lose her job. So this nurse had a choice. Do I do the wrong thing in order to keep my job, or do I do the right thing and risk losing my job? Now, she wasn't going to do the right thing without putting up a fight. So she went to other authorities and got connected to lawyers and different people to try to protect her right to hold her job but not administer the morning after pill. She was, however, willing to lose her job should it come to that. The good news is twofold. Not only in taking her firm stance and not only in getting help was she able to protect her job and make sure that she could keep her job without administering the morning after pill, but she had several colleagues who weren't religious at all but were against abortion, but had been involved with abortions. And because she took a very firm and courageous stance regarding the morning after pill, those nurses decided that they no longer wanted to be involved in doing abortions. What comes to mind is a great scene in one of the older versions of Spider-Man where Peter Parker just begins to get his Spider-Man powers and he's in the car with his Uncle Ben. And Uncle Ben looks at him and says, "Remember, Peter, with great power comes great responsibility. With great power comes great responsibility." This nurse had power not only over the patients she directly worked with, but with her colleagues by her example. And she used that power very responsibly. A friend of mine used to work in construction, and as he was driving to his construction site with a colleague of his one day, they got talking and he brought up the topic of abortion. And he asked his colleague what he thought, and the colleague was in favor of abortion. And so my friend just started to share basic pro-life apologetics, asked good questions, talked about what abortion does. And the next day, or a couple days later, he walked into one of the places where they were working, and the colleague he'd spoken with was talking to a bunch of other colleagues, and abortion was being discussed. And my friend on that other day was thinking, oh, I don't want to get into another discussion about abortion. But as he listened to the dialogue going on, he realized the colleague he'd spoken to a couple days before was making all the same arguments to those people they work with that my friend had made a few days prior. Wherever we're positioned, we have the opportunity to reach out to others and to ask good questions in order to have transformative conversations. An accountant friend of mine heard one of my pro-life talks and sees that as an opportunity to ask a colleague what she thought about abortion. It's a great way to bring it up without being too weird by saying, I attended this lecture the other night by this Canadian who was speaking about abortion, and I was curious, gosh, I've never asked you, what do you think about abortion? And that way you can have the conversation. So once again, this accountant, in her case, started to share what she'd learned when she talked to this colleague of hers, and that colleague changed her mind in just a few short minutes with a few basic questions that were asked. I'm also reminded of a nursing student that I know back in Canada where euthanasia has just become legal. And this nursing student walked into a room, and just before she went into the room of one of the patients where she was working in the hospital, she read the patient's chart. And in the patient's chart it said, patient has expressed interest in euthanasia. And so this nursing student I know kind of panicked inside thinking, I don't agree with this, I don't know if I can bring this up, but I don't want this patient to pursue this, what do I do? And she thought to herself, I'm just going to love her. I'm going to give her extra attention. I'm going to talk to her more. I'm going to try to be a bright light in this room more often than other places of the hospital. And so she very intentionally, each shift, spent more time with the patient, talked to the patient, learned about the patient's cultural background, which was similar to her own. And they started to bond and connect. And the patient was so excited every time this nursing student came in. About a couple weeks later, the nursing student looked at the chart and saw patient has withdrawn interest in euthanasia. With great power comes great responsibility. And so the final story I'd like to leave you with regarding using our position of influence to make a positive difference is to reference the unsung hero in the whole experience I had speaking at Google, which is the Google staff member. That staff member had worked at Google for only approximately 1 month when he reached out to me. He was familiar with my work. Having just moved over to work at Google, he learned about their series called Talks at Google. And the immediate thought that came to his mind, knowing about this series and knowing about my work, was, I'm going to see if Stephanie Gray would be willing to speak here. And it's that staff member who threw my name into the ring, who worked diligently to do all the paperwork and all the details that needed to go into making that presentation happen. It would not have happened if it weren't for that staff member. A lot of times people look at my work and they say, oh, you are so courageous. Oh my goodness, like the people you debate, the audiences. And I think, wait, my job is designed to get into debates, to essentially get into fights. It's designed to, be intense. When I show up, people know I'm there to debate. It's way more difficult to be that staff member at Google. It's way more difficult to be working in the political field. It's way more difficult to be a physician, to be a nurse, to be that construction guy talking to a colleague. Because in those contexts, we don't always expect abortion to come up. Or we don't always expect that we're going to be having to say the same thing Stephanie says, but not in front of an audience, but in front of this one individual that's a colleague, or that's a friend, or that's a family member. That's more challenging. But we all still need to do it. And that's my hope, is that you reflect on everything that I've shared tonight, that you start with that place of prayer, and from being filled up, let that overflow into your encounters, where you ask good questions of the people around you and raise your voice in order to make a positive difference. Besides texting my sister on April 19th last year, I also emailed my prayer support team. There's a small group of people that regularly pray for my ministry work. And a dear evangelical friend of mine sent me a very beautiful message. She said, Stephanie, this was the week after Easter last year. She said, I am praying for a Pentecostal event where you speak your own words and those who hear have them interpreted by the Holy Spirit into messages they can understand and accept. And so it's my prayer that we leave at some point this evening and you go to work tomorrow, that you have a Pentecostal moment where you create an opportunity to engage someone in a conversation, and the Holy Spirit takes the words that you've said and transforms them so they're communicated in a way so as to be received by the person who's hearing them. Thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions, so if you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you. If you could just hold it close to your mouth to make sure that it catches for our audio recording, that would be great.
Stephanie, thank you. And I watched your video at Google, and it was terrific. What was the response of the audience, and how many, as I refer to, friendlies did you experience versus hostiles, and how did you deal with that subsequent to the talk?
Great question. I would say the audience overall, the term I use is pensive. They were actually quite subdued and quiet, to the point that I thought my few jokes were quite funny, but I expected more of a reaction from them. So I went in thinking, could this be like the college campuses I go to? Is it going to be really hostile? You have all types that work at Google. You have very conservative people, but also very liberal people as well. And so I would say they were remarkably pensive and calm. There was no hostility expressed whatsoever. There were also Googlers tuning in through an internal live stream system at Google offices around the world. And they, unfortunately, while they could see, they couldn't ask questions. So the only questions I was able to receive were from the direct audience, and they all seemed to be, quiet and pensive and subdued is the word I think of.
Yeah, we always hear about how conservative speakers at colleges, they have protests, they have, riots. What has the response been? And because I'm concerned about the mood on the college campuses. What has the response been? Have you had to be escorted out by security, or what has been your experience?
Great question. I would say I have experienced some very hostile audiences. I've had police protection, even accompanying me to the bathroom. I was like, really, is that necessary? But I mean, she stayed outside, but the female officer was like, I'm going with you. I'm like, okay. So there have been a few occasions where I've needed that, but I would say the vast majority that hasn't been needed. And I would say from my colleagues in the field who do similar work, yes, there have been some cases where people have made outbursts. Usually it's more the fear of violence than this actual violence. It's more verbal disruption, which just becomes annoying and it drags the evening out because you have to wait for police to remove people so you can carry on. So that happens on a minority of occasions, but I would say the vast majority, in my experience, has at least been civil. Even if the audience members aren't all in agreement and can even get a little agitated, there is still a spirit of civility. The microphone's back there. Sorry, I'm not in charge of that. Rosemary will bring it around.
Thank you so much for your talk. It's very clear that you have a real charism for evangelization and teaching, so it's very inspiring, I'm sure, to all of us to hear that and think about how we can apply that. What became very clear to me as you spoke is that, first of all, I agree with you completely that question asking is so important. But what became clear to me is that flows from a genuine interest in others. And we all have that to some degree, but some of us have it more than others. And I know that can be developed through closeness to Christ in the sacraments, because when we see him, we learn to see him in others. But I'm wondering, my question is, from a practical standpoint, how would you recommend for those of us that maybe need to develop more of a genuine interest in others so that those questions can flow? How do you develop that? Less time on social media, for example, less time with your earphones in, things like that. I'm just curious, you and people you love, what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, very important to consider. When I've been on some college campuses, not in the context of debates or presentations, but in the context of pro-life exhibits where I have experienced some degree of hostility from people, I mean, there have been times where I have dealt with people that they're vicious. I mean, they're swearing in your face, they're yelling, and I have literally just looked at them, and in my mind I'm saying, Jesus, help me see your face in this person. Jesus, help me love this person. And it can almost be like just a desperate cry because you don't feel the love. Like, you know that you will their good. I never will evil on these people, but you don't have that affection or, because of the context. And so literally just a cry of, Lord, help me love this person. Lord, help me see you in this person. So I think really entering into prayer and being intentional in our prayer to ask God to move in our hearts to see the other person as he sees the other person. I've had that prayer answered in all different kinds of contexts. When I have said, Lord, help me see this person as you see them, it is truly transformative, what happens in the heart. One of my favorite prayers is the prayer of Saint Francis. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. And midway through that prayer, we say, O divine master, grant that I may not so much seek to be understood as to understand. And I think the more we pray that prayer, Lord, may I understand this person, the more someone seems unlovable, like they're that angry, bitter, swearing, yelling person, or obnoxious, and you're like, really? If we step back and say, Lord, help me to understand where they're coming from. In my experience, I have heard the stories of where these people are coming from. I met a girl who told me the week prior she was at a party, felt sick, fell asleep, and woke up being raped. I met another student who told me the night before her only close relative had just committed suicide, and she herself had been bounced around the foster care system her whole life. I met another student who told me his parents were crystal meth addicts, and the abuse that he endured, especially from his father, was so horrifying, he wished in those moments that he were dead. And when you hear the stories from people that influences why they're hostile, or why they're rude, or why they're sarcastic, it really does change our heart. And we really can develop an instantaneous compassion for the profound pain that people are walking with. So I think to ask God in the moment, to ask God prior to the moment in prayer, and to really seek to understand what that person's story is. And if we're gentle enough with them and they happen to share it, our attitudes and affections will change pretty rapidly.
Hi, Stephanie. I've had a similar experience giving talks, but they've been censored. Like, I gave a TED talk that just was totally dropped from the webpage. How do you deal with that kind of stuff?
When it's
dropped, when it's totally censored?
It's very frustrating. It depends. I mean, in some environments, we will, like when I was working on college campuses in Canada, we faced a lot of censorship. So we would have lawyers that would then take on the censorship case and fight against the university or the university administration that was suppressing the message from getting out. So I would say that if you're dealing with like a public institution or a public body that is censoring something that they have no right to censor, then I think we need to battle that. I think we need to defend our rights to free speech, realizing it's not just our rights to free speech, it's the next person's rights to free speech. And if this view can be suppressed, well, what about this other view and what about this other person? So that's where here in America, there's a great organization, one of the offices here in DC. I don't know if we have any staffers here tonight, but the Alliance Defending Freedom. They run a number of programs that I help speak through their programs. But they are a phenomenal organization that take on pro-life, pro-family, and religious freedom cases pro bono, and they will defend people's rights against their rights to free speech. But in terms of if there's any private entity that maybe have let you in or said they wanted you in and then they change their mind or they take something off the internet, my understanding is that would be their right to do that. So it would be frustrating. We could try public shaming, but you might not necessarily have a legal right to defend your expression.
Hello, my name is Alex Wilson. I'm from St. Charles Catholic Church. We go to pray in front of abortion clinics. I'm very curious to know. First of all, I love your speech. It's very brilliant. I think I just needed to be here. When I listen to a couple of your questions, in my mind, I'm like, okay, this is good. I'm ready to leave. In the sense that I have all the information I needed. It's a great compliment to you. What would you say if you're in front of an abortion clinic, you only have but a few seconds, when you see a mother get ready to enter the clinic, what would you say to them? You have a very short time. Thank you.
Yes. So I will say that my area of expertise is in apologetics. It's in one-on-one conversations. It isn't in sidewalk counseling. So I have been outside of clinics praying. I have seen sidewalk counselors work, but it's not my training or my expertise. So I would say ultimately I would recommend you contact, sidewalk counseling organizations that have a success rate that's very impressive, where women do turn around, where they do change their mind, where babies are saved, and find out what are you asking, what are you saying, what are you doing that's making a difference. And there's one organization in particular I've been very impressed with, Sidewalk Advocates for Life. Lauren Mazuka, I think is how you pronounce her last name. She and I spoke at an event in Missouri, and I was thoroughly impressed with their success rate and what they do. So she would probably have some great ideas of what you can say at that 11th hour, because you're right, you literally have seconds, and like I said at one point, you can ask questions, but some questions are better than others, so you really want to ask the best. And I could throw ideas out there, but I think the specialists in that field should answer that question.
We have time for one more question.
I have a question. How do you ask the question format in a presentation that you're giving? Like, I teach graduate students and law, and sometimes I sit there and I'm like, well, your opinion on this case, and I just get like blah or nothing. And so from a lecture presentation perspective, how do you get that insight back?
Yes. So you can ask questions rhetorically where you're not necessarily they're not going to answer, because there's that element when you've got an audience where people don't want to be the presenter. So they think if I raise my hand and I answer this question, all eyes are suddenly on me and I don't want to be up there type thing. So there could just be some of that, but even just asking a question that you yourself answer is going to result in them thinking, how would I answer that? Or what do I think? So there's still merit to asking the questions even if they're not answering. And then see if you can maybe make the questions a little more controversial. When something people have strong opinions on, there's always going to be one or two that are willing to voice that, and that's going to engage the audience more. So I think that might help. One thing I will say, especially because we don't have time for more questions, is one, I'm happy to speak with people one-on-one, especially those whose questions we didn't have time for. And two, I noticed you have some copies of my book on sale here, and that gives some specific question examples that you can ask in different settings, and questions that reach the head and questions that reach the heart, how to draw people's stories out, where they're coming from, how to have that academic discussion with them. So all of that is in the book, which is for sale here. So, but again, I'd happily speak with people one-on-one, and I'll let Rosemary wrap up. Thank you.
Again, my name is Rosemary Holt, and I want to thank you all so much for joining us tonight for our discussion with Stephanie Gray. We are able to host such wonderful events and speakers and start meaningful conversations around issues facing everyday Catholics because of your continued presence and support, so thank you. I'd also like to thank Stephanie for having the courage to speak and write on this important issue. And I know you mentioned earlier during your discussion that, you're not the courageous one, and that, the individual lay people who are just having everyday encounters with their friends and their family are the courageous ones, but you inspire that courageousness in people like me, so thank you. And I know it's not always easy to proclaim the truth, especially in an increasingly hostile environment. And life issues are a very sensitive topic, and you, Stephanie, approach them with the utmost compassion, clarity, and charity, so thanks. And if you love tonight's event, I encourage you to visit our website at cacdc.org and check out some of our amazing event lineups. Stephen Barr will speak on March 19th about the Society of Catholic Scientists and discuss the relationship between science and the Catholic faith. And then on April 11th, the Hillbilly Thomas will join us for a performance from their self-titled debut album and a discussion on the unique role music can play in evangelization. I invite you to stay for our reception that will go until 8 p.m. right outside the chapel, and thank you again for coming.